Moscow, Kremlin, July 24, 1945. Joseph Stalin sits across from Harry Truman at the Potsdam Conference. The American president leans forward, his voice carefully measured, and delivers what he believes is his trump card. "We have," Truman says, "a new weapon of unusual destructive force." Stalin nods slowly, his face betraying nothing. He responds with studied indifference. "A powerful weapon," he says flatly. "I hope you will make good use of it against the Japanese." Truman walks away confident. He has just intimidated the Soviet dictator with America's nuclear monopoly. The calculation is simple. With this ultimate weapon in hand, the United States can dictate the terms of the post-war world. The Soviets will have no choice but to yield. But Stalin's face, blank moments before, now shifts. His eyes narrow with something close to amusement. Unknown to Truman, unknown to the entire American intelligence apparatus, Stalin has known about the Manhattan Project since the early 1940s. His spy network, one of the most extensive in human history, has been feeding him detailed reports for years. The American president thinks he holds all the cards. Stalin knows better. The nuclear monopoly Truman is counting on is already dissolving before his eyes. This is the beginning of the Cold War, a 45-year struggle that will consume two superpowers, threaten the existence of human civilization, and prove, again and again, that the confident predictions of generals, presidents, and dictators mean nothing when confronted with the chaotic reality of global conflict. At the end of the Second World War, the globe is a ruin. 6 years of fighting have claimed over 60 million lives. From this devastation rise two giants. The United States of America, a liberal democracy rooted in capitalism, possessing the world's strongest economy and the only operational nuclear weapons on Earth, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a vast communist federation covering 1/6 of the land surface of the planet, hardened by brutal defensive fighting that cost them 27 million dead. They fought together as allies to defeat Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. But their victory only unveiled a deeper, more profound ideological fault line. For almost 45 years, these two major powers will be locked in a face-off without direct confrontation. This is the Cold War, a struggle defined not by pitched battles between Soviet and American troops, but by profound miscalculation, proxy conflict, technological rivalry, and the ever-present shadow of nuclear annihilation. It is a war fought across diplomatic tables, in laboratories, in the jungles of Vietnam and the streets of Berlin. And crucially, it is fought in the minds of leaders who repeatedly fail to grasp the true scale of the forces they have unleashed. Stalin's post-war strategy is rooted in one overwhelming imperative: never again. The Nazi invasion cost the Soviet Union more lives than any nation in human history. 27 million people, entire cities reduced to rubble, villages burned, families erased. The memory of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's surprise invasion in 1941, haunts every Soviet military planner. Stalin's solution is brutally simple: create a wide, impermeable buffer zone against the West by installing pro-Soviet governments across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. They will serve as a defensive wall, a cordon sanitaire to prevent another invasion. His logic is clear: establish Soviet influence, suppress any form of opposition within the Soviet sphere, keep the Americans at bay. The American strategy, meanwhile, is rooted in overwhelming economic and military superiority. The United States emerges from World War II virtually unscathed on the home front. Its industrial capacity is unmatched. Its economy is booming. And crucially, it holds the ultimate military edge. It is the only power with nuclear weapons. 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 demonstrated their devastating power. 140,000 dead in Hiroshima, 70,000 in Nagasaki, Entire cities vaporized in seconds. President Harry Truman, who succeeded Franklin Roosevelt in April 1945, is determined not to yield to Stalin's expansionist demands. At Potsdam, when Truman receives word of the first successful test of a nuclear bomb in the New Mexico desert on July 16, he believes he has the leverage to force Soviet concessions. The Americans calculate that their nuclear monopoly will last at least a decade, perhaps longer. They are supremely confident, but Stalin's calculation is already factoring in the American bluff. His spies have given him the blueprint. The dictator is undeterred. Within 4 years, the American military advantage will be gone. Stalin moves swiftly to consolidate his position. In September 1947, he establishes the Communist Information Bureau, known as Cominform, to ensure compliance within his satellite states. Soviet troops occupy Eastern Europe. Elections are rigged. Opposition leaders are arrested or executed. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill will call it, descends across the continent, when the Western Allies merge the territories they control in Germany, creating a unified economic zone in violation of agreements signed with the Soviets. Stalin retaliates. On June 24, 1948, he begins the Berlin blockade. All ground access to West Berlin, which remains under Allied control deep inside the Soviet-occupied zone, is cut off. 2.5 million people trapped. No food, no fuel, no supplies. The Soviet calculation is confident. Isolation will force the Western powers, Britain, France, and America, to withdraw. West Berlin will fall into Soviet hands within weeks, but Truman refuses to yield. Instead, he orders the Berlin Airlift. For 15 months, American and British cargo planes fly around the clock, delivering supplies to the city. 277,000 flights, 2.3 million tons of food, coal, and medicine. At the height of the operation, a plane lands in West Berlin every 30 seconds. The airlift costs the United States $224 million. It saves the city. Stalin's prediction collapses. On May 12, 1949, he ends the blockade. The Americans and their allies establish an independent West German state. The Soviets respond the following month by creating the German Democratic Republic in the East. Germany is now divided, a physical manifestation of the ideological split consuming the world. But Stalin's greatest miscalculation, his belief that the nuclear disparity will hold his enemies at bay, is shattered on August 29, 1949. In the remote steppes of Kazakhstan, at a site called Semipalatinsk, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb. Code-named First Lightning, the device produces a yield of 22 kilotons, slightly more powerful than the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. American seismologists detect the blast. Intelligence analysts are stunned. The nuclear monopoly is over. The Soviets have used research stolen from the West. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working on the Manhattan Project, passed detailed blueprints to Soviet intelligence. The Americans calculated they had a decade. They had 4 years. The arms race begins, and it is driven by a mutual miscalculation. The belief that these new, terrifying weapons are deployable tools of statecraft. That nuclear bombs can be used to win wars, to force concessions, to dominate the globe. This assumption will bring the world to the brink of annihilation multiple times over the next 45 years. The American response to the Soviet nuclear success is panic. On January 31, 1950, Truman announces the development of the super bomb, the thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb, theoretically 1,000 times more powerful than the devices dropped on Japan. The calculation is clear. If the Soviets have atomic weapons, America must leap ahead with even more destructive technology. The race to build bigger, deadlier weapons accelerates. The United States had hoped containment could be achieved through economic superiority. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, poured over $13 billion into rebuilding Western Europe. The goal was to create prosperous democracies that would resist communist influence. But the ideological battle shifts immediately to proxy conflict. Local disputes spiral into massive, devastating wars that defy both sides' initial predictions of scale and outcome. The first major confrontation arises in Korea in 1950. On June 25th, 75,000 North Korean troops, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, pour across the 38th parallel and invade South Korea. The offensive is swift and brutal. Within 3 days, the North Korean army captures Seoul. Within weeks, South Korean and American forces are pushed back to a small defensive perimeter around the port city of Busan. Stalin approved the invasion. His calculation is straightforward. The Americans are preoccupied in Europe. They won't risk a major war in Asia. South Korea will fall quickly, bringing the entire peninsula under communist control. The United States, guided by the domino theory, the idea that if one nation falls to communism, neighboring countries will follow, responds with overwhelming force. Truman commits American troops to lead a United Nations coalition. By September, over 140,000 American soldiers are fighting in Korea. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander, predicts a swift victory. He plans an amphibious assault at Incheon, a port city behind enemy lines. The landing, executed on September 15th, is a stunning success. Within 2 weeks, UN forces recapture Seoul. By October, they push deep into North Korea, advancing toward the Chinese border along the Yalu River. MacArthur's confidence is absolute. He tells Truman the war will be over by Christmas. The Chinese, he calculates, will not intervene. They lack the military capacity. They lack the will. The United Nations forces will reunify Korea under a pro-Western government. It will be a decisive victory for containment. But MacArthur's prediction is catastrophically wrong. On October 19, 1950, Chinese forces crossed the Yalu River. Mao Zedong, viewing the American advance as a direct threat to China, commits 300,000 troops to assist North Korea. They strike at night, moving silently through the mountains, surrounding UN positions. The attack is devastating. American forces, caught completely off guard, are driven back in chaotic retreat. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, fought in November and December in brutal sub-zero temperatures, becomes one of the most harrowing engagements of the war. 30,000 UN troops, mostly American and British Marines, are surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers. Temperatures drop to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons freeze. Medical supplies run out. Men suffer from frostbite and hypothermia. The Marines fight their way south in a 17-day fighting withdrawal, suffering over 15,000 casualties but preventing a complete encirclement. The military miscalculation is devastating. The conflict MacArthur promised would end by Christmas drags on for 3 more years. It becomes a brutal stalemate. Trench warfare reminiscent of World War I. Artillery bombardments, massed infantry assaults. The front line barely shifts. The loss of life is staggering. Over 2 million people die. 360,000 soldiers on the communist side. 178,000 on the UN side. Over 1.5 million civilians. Crucially, the conflict establishes a precedent that defies the expectations of military leaders like MacArthur. Despite pressure from the army, despite calls to use America's nuclear advantage, President Truman refuses to consider using atomic weapons in Korea. The calculation has shifted. The Soviets now have their own bombs. Any nuclear strike risks escalation into global war. MacArthur, furious at the restrictions placed on him, publicly criticizes Truman. On April 11, 1951, Truman fires him. The war ends on July 27, 1953, with an armistice. The border between North and South Korea is almost exactly where it was before the war began. The 38th parallel. The conflict accomplished nothing except mass death and destruction. The Korean War proves that proxy conflicts, once unleashed, are impossible to control. The initial calculations of both sides, confident predictions of swift victory, mean nothing. The technological rivalry continues to yield shocks. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The small metal sphere, 83.6 kilograms in weight, orbits the Earth every 96 minutes, transmitting a radio signal that can be heard by anyone with the right equipment. This is a massive psychological victory for the Soviets. It proves they hold the lead in rocketry. If they can launch a satellite, they can deliver a nuclear warhead anywhere on the planet. The Americans are shocked. The public panics. Politicians demand answers. How did the Soviets get ahead? President Dwight Eisenhower, who succeeded Truman in 1953, accelerates American space and missile programs. The space race, a competition for technological and ideological supremacy, begins. The Soviet lead continues. On April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human to orbit the Earth. His flight aboard Vostok 1 lasts 108 minutes. When he returns, he is a global hero. The Soviet Union celebrates the achievement as proof of communist superiority. The Americans, once again, are left scrambling to catch up. Yet, the Soviets are fighting a losing internal battle in Europe. Since 1949, around 2.7 million East Germans have defected to the West. Most escape through West Berlin, the only gap in the Iron Curtain where movement between East and West is still possible. The defectors are usually highly trained and educated. Doctors, engineers, scientists, teachers. Their departure is bleeding the East German economy dry. The numbers are growing daily. In 1961 alone, over 200,000 East Germans flee. Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin after his death in 1953, is desperate to prevent the collapse of East Germany. The defections are an embarrassment. They undermine the legitimacy of the communist system. If communism is superior, why are people fleeing? Khrushchev seeks to secure the city. At a summit meeting in Vienna on June 4, 1961, he confronts the new American president, John F. Kennedy. Khrushchev gives Kennedy an ultimatum. The United States has 6 months to vacate Berlin. If they refuse, the Soviets will sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, handing control of all access routes to the East German government. Kennedy refuses. The United States will not abandon West Berlin. The confrontation is tense. Khrushchev calculates that Kennedy, young and inexperienced, will back down under pressure. He is wrong. Khrushchev authorizes a drastic solution. On the night of August 12, 1961, East German soldiers and construction crews begin erecting a barrier around West Berlin. It starts as a barbed wire fence. Within days, it becomes a concrete wall, 12 feet high, nearly 100 miles long, encircling the entire western half of the city. Guard towers are installed every few hundred yards. Minefields and tank traps are laid. Soldiers are given orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross. The Berlin Wall is an admission of failure. It is an embarrassment for communists everywhere. As President Kennedy will state during a visit to West Berlin on June 26, 1963, freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. The wall becomes the most visible symbol of the Cold War, a physical manifestation of the ideological divide. But the climax of miscalculation and risk occurs the following year during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In April 1961, the United States launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt by CIA-backed Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government. The invasion was a disaster. All 1,400 exiles were killed or captured within 3 days. Castro, now firmly aligned with the Soviet Union, requests military support. Khrushchev seizes the opportunity. In the summer of 1962, Khrushchev begins secretly deploying Soviet soldiers, military equipment, and nuclear missiles to Cuba. 42,000 Soviet troops, 42 medium-range R-12 ballistic missiles, each capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, 80 cruise missiles, bombers. The missiles, once operational, will be able to strike targets across most of the United States. Estimated casualties, 80 million Americans. Khrushchev's gamble is based on a faulty calculation. He believes President Kennedy will have little ground to oppose him. After all, the United States has already deployed Jupiter missiles, aimed at the Soviet Union, to Turkey and Italy. Khrushchev is simply doing the same thing. He later explains his logic to his advisors. They would learn just what it feels like to have enemy missiles pointing at you. We would be doing nothing more than giving them a little taste of their own medicine. The American president, still reeling from the Bay of Pigs disaster, will accept the missiles as a fait accompli. But Khrushchev catastrophically underestimates Kennedy's response. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying over Cuba photographs the missile sites under construction. Intelligence analysts identify the missile launchers. They calculate the range. They estimate the destructive capability. The photos are delivered to Kennedy on the morning of October 16. Kennedy is stunned. He immediately convenes a secret meeting of his closest advisors, a group that will become known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. For the next 13 days, the world teeters on the brink of nuclear war. The full scale of the danger is not apparent even to Kennedy's inner circle. It will only be revealed decades later. Kennedy's options are limited. He can do nothing, allowing the missiles to become operational. This is politically impossible. He can launch airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, risking Soviet retaliation. He can invade Cuba, removing Castro and the missiles by force. Or he can implement a naval blockade, preventing further Soviet shipments while negotiating a diplomatic solution. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by Air Force General Curtis LeMay, push for immediate airstrikes followed by an invasion. LeMay is confident. He calculates that the Soviets will not respond. They cannot afford a war. Kennedy is skeptical. He remembers the confident predictions before the Bay of Pigs. He remembers MacArthur's assurances in Korea. He knows that once military action begins, events spiral beyond anyone's control. On the evening of October 22nd, Kennedy addresses the nation on television. He reveals the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. He announces a naval quarantine, a blockade of the island. Any Soviet ship carrying offensive weapons will be turned back. He demands the immediate removal of all missiles. The United States military is placed on DEFCON 3, then DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached during the Cold War. 140,000 invasion troops are stationed in Florida. B-52 bombers armed with nuclear weapons are placed on continuous airborne alert. The world holds its breath. In Moscow, Khrushchev is caught off guard. He did not expect Kennedy to react so forcefully. The blockade is in place. Soviet ships, carrying additional missiles and equipment, are steaming toward Cuba. If they attempt to cross the quarantine line, American warships will intercept them. Khrushchev must decide. Does he order his ships to proceed, risking confrontation? Or does he back down, humiliating the Soviet Union? The confrontation in the Atlantic nearly triggers global annihilation. On October 27th, a Soviet submarine, B-59, is detected near the quarantine line. American destroyers move to intercept, using signaling depth charges, small explosives designed to force the submarine to surface. But the submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, does not understand the American signals. His submarine has been submerged for days. Communications are severed. The air inside is stale. The temperature is over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew is exhausted, disoriented. Savitsky hears the explosions and believes they are under attack. He believes war has already begun. Savitsky orders the submarine's nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launch. The torpedo carries a warhead with a yield of 15 kilotons, the same size as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. If launched, it will destroy the American destroyers. It will almost certainly trigger a full-scale nuclear war. But Soviet protocol requires the approval of all 3 senior officers on board to authorize the use of nuclear weapons. Savitsky gives the order. The submarine's political officer agrees. The 3rd officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refuses. Arkhipov, a 42-year-old naval officer, argues against the launch. He points out that they have received no orders from Moscow. They do not know if war has been declared. Launching the torpedo without confirmation could be a catastrophic mistake. His refusal saves the world. Savitsky, furious but unable to proceed without unanimous consent, orders the submarine to surface. The crisis passes. The American destroyers allow the submarine to return to the Soviet Union. Vasily Arkhipov's name will remain unknown for decades. But his decision, made under unimaginable pressure in the suffocating heat of a submarine deep in the Atlantic, single-handedly prevents the outbreak of nuclear war. Meanwhile, the diplomatic confrontation continues. Khrushchev realizes the situation is spiraling out of control. On October 26th, he sends a letter to Kennedy offering to remove the missiles if the United States promises not to invade Cuba. The following day, a second letter arrives, demanding that the United States also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy and his advisors are divided. Some want to reject the second letter and accept only the first. Others argue for a broader agreement. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, suggests a compromise. Publicly accept the first letter. Privately assure the Soviets that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey will be removed within a few months. On October 28th, Khrushchev agrees. He announces that the Soviet missiles in Cuba will be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. The crisis is over, but the full scale of the danger is only revealed years later. It turns out that Khrushchev had covertly stationed 42,000 Soviet troops on Cuba, far more than American intelligence estimated. These troops were equipped with tactical nuclear weapons, short-range missiles designed to destroy an invading force. Had Kennedy chosen to invade, as the Joint Chiefs recommended, Soviet commanders on the ground had authorization to use these weapons without waiting for approval from Moscow. A full-scale nuclear war would have almost certainly followed. The casualty estimates are staggering. Tens of millions dead in the first hours. Hundreds of millions in the following weeks as radiation spreads and infrastructure collapses. The Cuban Missile Crisis forces both superpowers to confront the reality of their miscalculations. The confident assumptions of military leaders, the belief that nuclear weapons can be used as tools of diplomacy, the idea that the other side will back down under pressure, all of it is revealed as catastrophically dangerous. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later admits, "We were lucky. We came that close to nuclear war, and we had no idea." The crisis leads to the establishment of a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, the so-called Red Telephone Hotline, to prevent future misunderstandings. It also leads to the development of a new strategic doctrine, mutually assured destruction, known by its fitting acronym MAD. The policy requires both sides to ignore the targeting of military facilities and instead plan to cause the maximum number of casualties possible by targeting enemy cities directly. The logic is perverse but clear. If both sides know that any nuclear exchange will result in total annihilation, neither side will risk starting one. MAD formally enshrines the logic of total destruction to prevent limited war. But the lessons of miscalculation are only partially learned. The failures of prediction continue in Vietnam. In the early 1960s, the United States becomes increasingly involved in the conflict between North and South Vietnam. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, is a communist state supported by the Soviet Union and China. The South, led by a series of authoritarian governments, is supported by the United States. American military advisors, initially numbering a few hundred, grow into a full-scale combat force. By 1965, fearing a communist takeover of the South, President Lyndon Johnson commits over 500,000 American soldiers to Vietnam. American generals assure the public and politicians that victory is in sight. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces, repeatedly predicts that the enemy is on the verge of collapse. He calculates that superior American firepower, advanced technology, and overwhelming troop numbers will crush the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong guerrillas operating in the South. Westmoreland's strategy is based on attrition. Kill more enemy soldiers than they can replace. The U.S. military tracks progress through body counts, the number of enemy dead reported after each engagement. The assumption is simple. If we kill enough of them, they will give up. But Westmoreland grossly underestimates the scale of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong resistance. He underestimates their willingness to absorb casualties. He underestimates their ability to resupply and reinforce their forces through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of jungle paths running through Laos and Cambodia. The colossal strategic miscalculation is exposed on January 30, 1968, during the Tet Offensive. Over 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers launch coordinated attacks on more than 100 South Vietnamese towns and cities. The offensive strikes during Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a time when a ceasefire had been observed in previous years. American and South Vietnamese forces are caught off guard. Viet Cong commandos assault the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, breaching the compound and holding it for 6 hours before being killed. The offensive is eventually repelled. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong casualties are enormous, over 40,000 dead. In purely military terms, it is a defeat for the Communists. But the psychological impact is devastating for the United States. The American public, watching the First Television War, sees the brutal reality brought into their homes. Footage of the embassy assault, of burning cities, of American soldiers fighting street to street, contradicts everything they have been told. General Westmoreland had assured them the war was nearly over. The Tet Offensive proves otherwise. The credibility gap, the loss of trust between the government and the public, becomes unbridgeable. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, travels to Vietnam to see the situation firsthand. On February 27, 1968, he delivers a special report. He concludes, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, yet unsatisfactory conclusion." When President Johnson watches the broadcast, he reportedly says, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The war drags on for 5 more years. The human cost is staggering. More than 58,000 Americans die. 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. Over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas, and over 2 million civilians from both the North and the South. The United States withdraws in 1973 under President Richard Nixon. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces capture Saigon. South Vietnam falls. The Communists achieve complete victory, inflicting a heavy defeat on the United States and tarnishing its image globally. The lesson is clear. Containment, the strategy that worked in Korea by maintaining the status quo, has proven ineffective in Vietnam. The confident predictions of American generals, their calculations based on firepower and technology, meant nothing. The miscalculation cost millions of lives. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union, under Leonid Brezhnev, is suffering severe internal difficulties. Brezhnev's 18-year rule, from 1964 to 1982, becomes known as the era of stagnation. The Soviet economy, heavily centralized and inefficient, is marked by corruption and a complete lack of innovation. Consumer goods are scarce. Agricultural production is declining. The population grows increasingly cynical. Despite signing the SALT I Treaty with the United States in 1972, which freezes the existing number of intercontinental and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the Soviets continue to escalate militarily. In 1977, they install new, more precise SS-20 missiles directed towards Europe. Each missile carries 3 independently targetable warheads. They can strike targets across Western Europe with unprecedented accuracy. This deployment marks the beginning of the Euro-missile crisis and sparks a new arms race. This final military buildup is the Soviets' fatal economic miscalculation. The USSR is investing up to 14% of its gross national product on the arms race. For comparison, the United States spends around 6%. The Soviet economy, already struggling, is pushed toward collapse. The leadership in Moscow calculates that matching American military power is essential to maintaining superpower status. They are wrong. The Soviet Union is running out of money. When Ronald Reagan assumes the U.S. presidency in 1981, he understands this fragility. Reagan, a former Hollywood actor turned politician, has spent years studying the Soviet system. He concludes that the only way to eliminate nuclear weapons is to force the Soviets into a new arms race they cannot win. He articulates his strategy bluntly. Their choice is to break their backs to keep up or to agree to reductions. This policy is called peace through strength. Reagan increases defense spending dramatically. The Pentagon's budget almost doubles between 1980 and 1985, rising from $143 billion to $294 billion. The cornerstone of his strategy is the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, nicknamed Star Wars by the media. This radical missile defense system is intended to use lasers and space-based platforms to intercept and destroy incoming Soviet missiles. The program is wildly ambitious. Many scientists doubt it is even technically feasible, but Reagan knows the Soviets are lagging far behind in computer technology. Their microchip industry is a decade behind the West. They cannot match the program. The goal is not necessarily to build SDI. The goal is to force the Soviets to spend themselves into bankruptcy trying to counter it. The bluff works, but it produces dangerous unintended consequences. The Soviet leadership panics. They fear the United States is preparing for a first strike. The logic is straightforward. If the Americans develop an effective missile defense, they could launch a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union and then use SDI to intercept the Soviet response. The balance of MAD, the mutual vulnerability that has prevented war, would be destroyed. This high-alert state leads to tragedy. On September 1, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747 carrying 269 passengers, accidentally strays into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula due to a navigation error. Soviet air defense, already on high alert, scrambles interceptors. The pilots misidentify the airliner as an American reconnaissance aircraft. At 0126 hours local time, a Soviet Sukhoi Su-15 fighter fires 2 air-to-air missiles. The Boeing 747 disintegrates. All 269 people on board, including 61 Americans, are killed. The international outrage is immense. Reagan calls it an act of barbarism. The Soviets initially deny responsibility, then claim the aircraft was on a spy mission. The incident escalates tensions to a level not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The situation reaches a breaking point that November during a NATO military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise, held from November 2nd to November 11th, simulates the transition from conventional war to nuclear war. It involves the participation of several heads of government. Radio silence is maintained to simulate realism. Nuclear release procedures are practiced. The Soviet leadership, paranoid and fearful, believes the exercise is a cover for an actual nuclear attack. Soviet intelligence reports indicate that NATO is preparing a first strike. The KGB places its agents in Western Europe on high alert. Soviet nuclear forces are prepared. Air units in East Germany and Poland are placed on high readiness. Bombers are fueled and armed. For several days, the world is closer to nuclear war than anyone realizes at the time. The Soviets eventually realize their mistake and stand down. The exercise concludes without incident. But Reagan is shaken when he learns how close the Soviets came to launching a preemptive strike. He later writes in his diary, "I feel the Soviets are so defense-minded, so paranoid about being attacked, that without being in any way soft on them, we ought to tell them no one here has any intention of doing anything like that." The Able Archer crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis 21 years earlier, reveals how easily miscalculation can spiral into catastrophe. A new Soviet leader takes power in March 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev, at 54 years old, is the youngest member of the Politburo. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev is the first Soviet official to fully recognize the dire consequences of the previous strategic errors. Facing years of economic stagnation, growing discontent, and an arms race that is bankrupting the country, he introduces sweeping reforms. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, aims to reform the Soviet economy by introducing limited market mechanisms. Glasnost, meaning transparency, aims to address corruption and political unrest by allowing greater freedom of speech and press. Gorbachev knows the arms race is crippling the Soviet economy. He seeks a way out. His willingness to negotiate builds trust with Reagan. The two leaders meet at a series of summits, in Geneva in 1985, in Reykjavik in 1986, and in Washington in 1987. The relationship between the two men, initially frosty, gradually warms. They find common ground. Both want to reduce the nuclear arsenals threatening their countries. The new level of cooperation culminates in the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty, on December 8, 1987. This momentous agreement eliminates an entire class of nuclear missiles. All ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers are banned. Over 2,500 nuclear weapons are destroyed. It is the first time both sides pledge to eliminate, not just limit, an entire category of weapons. Inspectors from both countries are allowed to verify compliance. But Gorbachev's reforms come too late. He signals that the Brezhnev Doctrine, the use of military force to suppress revolts in Eastern Europe, will no longer be enforced. He tells the leaders of Warsaw Pact nations they are on their own. Realizing they will not be crushed by Soviet tanks, reformers emerge across Eastern Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity Movement, a trade union led by Lech Walesa, forces the communist government to negotiate free elections. In Hungary, the government begins dismantling the barbed wire fence along its border with Austria, opening the first gap in the Iron Curtain. In 1989, a wave of democratic revolutions breaks out. In East Germany, mass protests erupt. On November 9th, a confused East German official, answering questions at a press conference, mistakenly announces that travel restrictions to West Berlin have been lifted immediately. Thousands of East Berliners rush to the checkpoints. The border guards, receiving no orders and overwhelmed by the crowds, open the gates. People flood through. They climb onto the Berlin Wall. They begin tearing it down with hammers and pickaxes. The symbol of the Cold War, the physical manifestation of division, is destroyed by ordinary people in a single night. Germany is reunited on October 3, 1990. The Soviet structure, weakened by decades of misallocation of resources, implodes. On December 25, 1991, 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns as president of the Soviet Union. He officially terminates the existence of the USSR. The 15 republics become independent states. The Cold War is over. The conflict concludes in a surprisingly quick and bloodless fashion after dominating international relations for almost 45 years. The ending defies the predictions of both sides. The Soviets believed their military buildup would ensure their survival as a superpower. Instead, it bankrupted them. The Americans believed containment and military superiority would eventually force Soviet collapse. They were right, but the cost in proxy wars, in Vietnam, in Korea, in Afghanistan, was far higher than anyone predicted. The Soviet miscalculation lay in prioritizing military parity and global influence over domestic economic welfare. They spent themselves into collapse. The American miscalculation lay in consistently underestimating the cost and complexity of containment in proxy wars. Millions died. Entire countries were devastated. The promised swift victories never materialized. The stories of individuals like Vasily Arkhipov, a mid-ranking naval officer who defied orders to launch a nuclear torpedo in 1962, highlight how the rational caution of a single person can prevent the total destruction predicted by leaders and systems. Arkhipov's decision, made in the suffocating heat of a submarine deep in the Atlantic, saved the world. Yet his name remained unknown for decades. There are undoubtedly others, Soviet and American officers, intelligence analysts, diplomats whose names we will never know, who made critical decisions that pulled humanity back from the brink. The most terrifying lesson of the Cold War, formalized in the policy of MAD, is that the actual outcome of major crises will always defy the predictions of those who initiate them. The sheer scale of modern weaponry means that total destruction is the only achievable outcome of a direct superpower conflict. The Great Ideological War, the struggle between capitalism and communism, became a decades-long exercise in avoiding that final, predictable outcome of total annihilation. The Cold War proved that confidence, the belief that events can be controlled, that the other side will yield, that technology provides decisive advantage, is the most dangerous force in international relations. Stalin's confidence that his spy network gave him leverage, Truman's confidence that the nuclear monopoly would last, MacArthur's confidence that China would not intervene, Khrushchev's confidence that Kennedy would accept missiles in Cuba, Westmoreland's confidence that superior firepower would bring victory in Vietnam, Brezhnev's confidence that military spending would ensure Soviet survival. Every single one of these calculations was wrong. The Cold War ended not because one side was right and the other wrong. It ended because one side ran out of money before the other. The ideological struggle, the battle between two visions of how humanity should organize itself, was ultimately decided by economic exhaustion and the realization that the arms race was leading nowhere except mutual destruction. We are left with a sobering truth. 45 years, tens of millions dead in proxy wars, trillions of dollars spent on weapons, multiple instances where the world came within minutes of nuclear annihilation. And in the end, it was the willingness of a single Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, to admit that the system was failing, that allowed the conflict to end peacefully. The legacy of the Cold War is visible today. The nuclear weapons remain, thousands of warheads still pointed at cities across the globe. The mistrust between Russia and the West persists. The proxy conflicts continue in different forms. But the greatest lesson, the one that must never be forgotten, is that the confident predictions of leaders mean nothing when confronted with the chaotic reality of global conflict. The Cold War was not won through superior strategy or moral righteousness. It was survived through luck, through the caution of individuals like Vasily Arkhipov, and through the eventual recognition that the cost of continuing was too high. The war of false assumptions ended. But the assumptions themselves, the belief that nations can control events, that military power ensures security, that the other side will eventually yield. These assumptions persist, and they remain as dangerous today as they were in 1945, when Joseph Stalin sat across from Harry Truman and hid his amusement at the American president's nuclear bluff. The greatest miscalculation of all may be the belief that we have learned from the Cold War. History suggests we rarely do.